the very best promotions will increase velocity and create limited margin erosion. And the worst promotions will create no velocity improvement and create massive margin erosion.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to an episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Krista Raymer, founder of Vetrina Group. Krista, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I am doing amazing, and thank you for having me.
Excited to dive in. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Really excited to talk to Krista. Excited to dive into cannabis retail. And I'm excited to talk to you too, Brian. How are you doing today?
Oh, man, that was really sweet of you, Kellen. I think we got a lot to talk about, and I think data is going to be a key focal point today, because I think what we talked about pre-show is that there are a lot of people out there that could probably use data as a good reference going forward. So, Krista, before we dive in, give a little background about yourself and kind of how you found your way to the cannabis space.
I went into one of the first rec stores when Canada went legal and stood in a cannabis store and watched as transactions were happening all around me, and nobody understood what they were purchasing, and the pricing of the inventory didn't make any sense, and the merchandising wasn't connected to like how the customer was actually utilizing the store. And I was standing there and being like, I don't know everything there is to know about weed, but I do know a lot about retail, and maybe there's something here. And that was about 4.5 years ago. And so we've been in the space ever since. So we work with retailers at Vetrina to drive in-store profitability through things like loyalty programs, assortment strategies, and promotional plans. But really, it comes down to making sure that we're aware of retail is one transaction at a time, and cannabis retail is a lot of little transactions. And so you've got a lot of customers and a lot of moving parts to try and figure out all at once.
So elaborate, one transaction at a time. What does that mean?
Yeah, when we think about how to grow a retail environment, we think about the fact that you need to attract customers, you need to retain them and increase the frequency to which they're purchasing over a year's time, as well as increase the amount that they spend while they're in store. And so if you want to get into the nitty gritty on how to grow a retail environment, you actually have to figure out how to grow the transaction volume and the size of the transactions. And that's where retail gets in the weeds really quickly. It is super easy to say, oh, we need a lot of new customers. We'll just spend this and not pay attention to what our cost of customer acquisition is to bring them in. But the long-term play is, how many are we actually turning into repetitive purchasers? What does that days between purchase look like? Understanding the customer life cycle is so important. And so transactions don't just happen. There's a lot that leads the customer to the transaction, and then there's going to be a lot that will define whether they come back or not. And being in tune with understanding, how do we bring in more customers? How do we keep them? And how do we get them to spend more is really what every retailer, both inside of cannabis and outside of cannabis, has struggled with and is trying to figure out how to better utilize data really over the last century.
There's a lot of points there that I want to elaborate on. First one is tracking the data is probably very difficult internally, right? If you are a retail business, understanding those costs from a transaction to transaction, it's probably very difficult to understand on a specific level, but probably having buckets to put people in probably is helpful, or at least a structure to understand that. And then on the consumer side, I wonder how many people who are listening to this are wondering hey, was I sold this product? Was I marketed to? How did I know that triggered this reaction to go in? Because I think sometimes we forget, right, that there's a lot of messages that you see on a regular basis that lead you to take an action. And that, I think, is the beauty of marketing.
Yeah, we use something when we're working with bud tenders or stores to think about how to sell or how to work with customers. And that is that we need to understand the customer set and setting. So if you understand what the customer wants as an outcome and where they're going to be consuming, you can do a lot more with making sure that the relevant information is shared with them at the right time. With marketing, with retail, this is about touch points. It's about making it feel relevant to the customer. The best stores that you walk into, you see your own values reflected back to you. And so being able to connect all of those parts is a big part of retail. The thing is there's all these historical marketing strategies, things including you need 7 touch points to make something resonate with a customer. And they actually work. in retail environments. You just bring them to physical form. So there is a combination of digital as well as physical when it gets to a retail environment. And that is, to your point, customers standing there in store and they're saying, like, I think I want this pre-roll. Is it because they've seen the pre-roll for the first time? Is it actually their idea? Or was there all of this information that influenced their decision making up into the point that they're standing on the sales floor and asking the budtender for the pre-roll? And that is really difficult to track when you're a retail environment, because there is both the parts that show up in the little tidbits that the customer leaves behind, maybe the way that they utilize the website or the way that they travel on the sales floor, but how you bring all of those data points together is really difficult.
In cannabis, it's a little different from a normal kind of retail experience, right? Because typically you walk into a dispensary and one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to have an interaction with a bud tender, right? Mm-hmm. And that bud tender typically has significant influence on what the consumer is going to purchase. So how do you kind of help retailers, A, educate their bud tenders, and then B, know that there is a lot of weight on that bud tender in terms of the interaction they have with the consumer? How do you kind of guide retailers through customizing that for their consumers to drive certain transactions and those kind of things?
Well, it's crazy, even in the way that we are talking about it right now, is that before the customer even gets to the store, they've likely already looked at the business online. And when you've looked at the website online, you've already got reference points. So they basically have already anchored themselves to something. So if you look at something online and it's like ounces for $99, the perception is that ounces are going to be $99. They come into the store. That is like a built-in assumption. So then when the bud tender interacts with them, does that bud tender interact with the same assumptions that the customer has already built, or are they brand new assumptions? And that is like one of the most difficult things right now to get right in cannabis, is that there is the customer online experience and how they're learning about the business. And then they're coming into the store, and are they being met with a bud tender that aligns the information in the same way that they've seen online? Probably not in most cases. And it's not bud tender's fault. Like, let's be really clear, is that there's something called bud tender bias. And that is the bias that they bring into the interactions. So I really believe that bud tenders are being influenced by the recommendations that they're making, maybe with product education or how brands are communicating with them, but also largely their own consumption preferences. What type of economic power they have within their retail environment to get access to different types of products and try different products. Like, are we doing a disservice by having expensive products in store and bud tenders making just over minimum wage and not able to afford those products? It will influence their ability to sell a more expensive product. And so those biases go into the interaction. So a bud tender, one, a big part of training with that team needs to be an awareness of what your own biases are. And also being very aware of how the customer might be perceiving the business prior to the meeting coming into the doors, so that we can help to connect the network there. Because the network is almost living as very like online or in store, but they're more interconnected than what we give them credit for.
So just to kind of take it one step further, they see the ounce online for $99. They're coming in likely looking for flower, or at least subconsciously. They get to the bud tender and they're like, hey, I'm interested in X or Y. And then in that moment, the bud tender can maybe read the cues and say, this person can be upsold. They're looking for a value product. They're looking for a premium product, or they're looking for a deal, right?
Yeah, totally. And what are those open-ended questions that a bud tender is asking? Like, I think that open-ended questions often show up as, what are you looking for today? Well, it's making the assumption that the customer is looking for something for themselves and that they know what they're looking for. Now, most customers will say, I know what I'm looking for. They do. They have an idea of the concept to which they're looking for, but do they know exactly the product? May or may not. And to your point earlier, bud tenders are incredibly influential and can get customers to try different products. And so there's a big opportunity to be able to close that loop there.
How long do you think bud tenders are going to be a staple within the industry? Because if you go to like
McDonald's,
the alcohol industry, I mean, McDonald's is food, I guess.
But they have like a digital board now where you can interact with the person.
No one interacts with people. How long do you think the bud tender is going to be a staple in the cannabis space?
Well, there are a lot of things that need to go right for McDonald's to be able to leverage a board, right?
Right.
Like
consistency.
Consistency, one. Two, everybody understands what a French fry tastes like.
Yeah, you're right.
Maybe,
Nice.
I mean, in this market or like Canadian and American markets, maybe in other markets I wouldn't. And like, you couldn't just pop up a McDonald's in a place that doesn't have hamburgers and French fries and assume that it's going to go perfectly without some additional support. And that is where the disconnect is that we still have a lot of new product innovation coming down the pipeline. We have massive menus. Like, I think if I remember correctly, there's only 80 something products available in a McDonald's, like SKUs. And so there's different combinations that exceed and make a menu much larger than that. But that is not the way that these stores are operating at all. And so as long as there is continued innovation and also continued complexity, I think that having a team in store that understands the product or available online is really important.
Yeah, I can only think about when I go into a dispensary and they hand me a binder and they're like, here, flip through this. And my anxiety just flies through. And I'm like, I know I want edibles. Can I have the list, please? Right. And it's a full binder of like turn.
They're like page 12 through 14.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know where.
Yeah.
I'll take the 3 I normally get.
We got super nerdy and did some analysis around strain sell-through in different markets. And usually the top performing strains have food or color in the name. And I was like, is this because those strains are what customers are really attracted to and excited about? Or is it because these strain names feel familiar? Now, the purchasing pattern wasn't the same when we looked at more advanced consumers or customers, meaning advanced being that they probably make more than 8 transactions in a year, somebody who's really confident in their purchasing decisions. And the strain names connected to those purchases were often like very aggressive and didn't necessarily need any relation to color and food. So color and food seems to be familiar and work for most customers, but the customers with the most experience in consumption liked more, or we're not sure if liked is like maybe the right correlation to assume there, but purchasing patterns aligned with more aggressive strain names.
Did those strain names, were they maintained across different product SKUs, meaning like this strain name is popular in flower as well as edibles, as well as vapes?
More so like different brands.
Okay.
So the same strain name across different brands, because there would also be a biasy there if you looked at that data without removing for if it was only one brand selling in that way. It's hard to connect, or from my experience in looking at the data, it's hard to connect outside of kind of once we get past flower and or maybe some concentrate and or maybe some like vape in different markets. Like you're not going to find edibles connected to it, and makes sense. But mostly like you need to look at that and analyze that data based off of it being purchased across different product or brands as well.
So let's go into the problem, right? Someone in the cannabis industry comes to you and they say, hey, Krista, I think I might have a problem. I'm not sure what's going on here.
Yeah.
You do some analysis. Are they in the percentage of they've got some understanding, they've got no understanding, or they've got like 50? Where do you put them, or most people, on like a graph?
Most people in the industry that we're having interactions with are really good at one area of the industry and maybe are struggling to figure out how the other parts come together. The groups that we work with at Vetrina are usually been in the industry for quite some time, have experience, and now we're getting into like optimizations. So we're identifying areas to which there can either be gross margin improvement, increase in the frequency of purchase, optimizations of customer acquisition, regaining lost market share, that kind of thing. And that's where we're really, really good. When we take a look at a retail environment, we always start with the data and then take a look at inventory and then take a look at the team and then take a look at marketing in that order, because you need those things to all be aligned for them to work well. Can't market an environment that doesn't have the right inventory to sell. And you can't guarantee that if you bring marketing initiatives and drive a bunch of people to the store and don't have the right team selling in the right way, that they're going to be retained. And so it's lost investment. And that's why we look at it in that way.
So when you guys kind of first get in contact with some of these retailers and they're like, hey, help me, do they all typically have a robust data set that some of them know how to interact with, some of them don't? Or is this kind of something new? I was just assuming that most of them have POS systems that are keeping track of all this, and most of them just don't know how to handle the information that they're keeping track of.
Yeah, like 95% plus percent are all going to have a really, really good data set. The reality, though, is it organized in a way that can be readable? Like, this is the one thing that I look at with the cannabis industry is we have so much data, and it is so specific because of the regulatory frameworks in most markets. It's just how to read it and know what to do with it is where teams get misguided along the way, or like look at something and are not sure what the conclusion is based off of that data. The very, very first thing is just like, is it in a format to which allows you to sort it differently? Like, do you have products that have similar attributes all connected? And this comes down to like things like the product masters in a POS and naming conventions, and making sure that you have not just flower as a category, but there's lots of different subcategories of flower so that you can see the data differently. When we look, oftentimes, like, you both laugh at the flower comment, but the struggle is real. Like, you have flower, it represents a significant portion of revenue. It therefore usually represents more than 200 SKUs in some capacity. And within that, you have, let's say, the low and the high end part of this is that you have like eighths all the way up to ounces usually, and maybe some product packages in between. And the customer purchasing pattern and the life cycle around purchasing is very different at an eighth versus at an ounce, as well as the decision tree to which a customer makes to get to making that purchase. And so if you don't have that parsed out in a way that allows you to see those things, you could look at your on-hand inventory in flower and say, yes, I've got just the right product. But maybe you have like too many eighths and not enough ounces, or you have over index, and I'm going to use like the nomenclature, but like indica, over index in strains that the customer is aligning to indica and under index in something like sativa. And we see that happen all the time. And it's really about being able to organize the data to see something clearly.
That has to be a difficult conversation because the person that's engaging with you is really excited. You open up the data, they say, hey, Krista, take a look at this. And you're like, problem number one, you got 90% of your business in a flower category that we can't parse out. Is that an ego difficulty for some of these people to realize that they got to go back to the drawing board and resegment out how they align that? Because sometimes we found is the person who set it up and is the founder, and then he's moved on and they just kind of been a historical way they've tracked it. I
mean, maybe when it was set up, it also was the right way at the time. Like that's the thing too, is it needs to be an evolution to all of these things. What worked like 3 years ago in the edible organization doesn't work today. We have a different type of SKU assortment. We have different types of flavors. We have different types of sub formats. And so what worked when it was set up might not work today. I think that's the biggest thing. And to your point, it's like anytime we're dealing with a business, there is some level of personal attachment to the things that have been tried. And the biggest part is just saying, is the business today the same as it was when it was set up? If it isn't, then maybe there's an opportunity to try something different. And how difficult is it to try that different thing? We often will get in and help to set it up. Like, I'm not going to sit there and say, hey, you need to change all your naming conventions without trying to help and get our hands dirty to make that happen, because it's a pain in the ass to do, but the impact is really great on the other side.
I like how you handled it. You're like, well, it could have been the right way when you did it back in the day. Is that how you instantly de-escalate those conversations?
Hey, okay, like don't air me here. But
like fire flower. It's like, but
all right, we'll say that they clean all the data's clean. It's parsed, it's organized. What are kind of some of the low-hanging fruits that your team kind of goes after first to help the retailer like at least start to get their feeding under them in terms of making data-driven decisions?
Understanding that the 80-20 rule, or like 70-30, depending on where the retail store is really true. And it plays out in inventory, it plays out in the team, and it plays out in marketing initiatives. So like 80% of the revenue is generated likely from 20% of the SKUs. 80% of the results are probably coming from 20% of the team. And 80% of your marketing initiatives probably aren't moving the needle. It's 20% that are. And getting into understanding those parts and where you can find it within your own data basically to say where are the things that we can make a change today and it have really big impact. The first thing is like really understanding your customer segmentations. So one of the first things we'll do is take a look at how you organize your customer. And that could either be by spend, it could be by purchasing frequency, it could be also what types of products they're purchasing, and get in and say, okay, well, who are the customers that are the most influential to our revenue? And then who are the ones that are just on that like bubble? Who could it be? The ones that are on the bubble are probably purchasing at other locations. And is there an opportunity for us to recapture some of their share of basket? Like they're spending X number over a year on cannabis and we represent 70%. How do we get it to like 75? How many more transactions is that going to be? So it's pulling out those parts. A lot of the time when people are like, what's the low hanging fruit? We'll just get the best and then get them to be better. And it's like, well, that's a hard push. You know, the greatest opportunity is like, what are the best customers or what are the best SKUs all have in common? And then what are the things that are just on the edge that we can share, make that best become larger and diversify it instead of just like deepening the best further. Does that?
Yeah,
I'm using my hands to explain.
I
think
this
that's
is an audio recording.
We can see you.
That's it. We understand. We understand perfectly. Because I think people need to remember that businesses spend money to acquire customers, right? And that second time they come maybe doesn't cost as much money from a marketing standpoint, but there is some investment that goes in it. Just to give you an example, as I purchase edibles probably every 2 months and I buy enough to get me through the 2 months. If I got an email that said, hey, Brian, like the edible brand that you want is on sale, I'm probably going to come back in before that 2 months off and purchase again. And that's where I think the marketing is so important to kind of pull more out from those consumers that might purchase more than they normally do.
What's complicated, though, is if they sent you an offer and they got you to buy twice as many edibles, would you be pushed out of the store for a longer period?
Depends. I might be more willing to give those products away because I've got more, because I see people more and it's like, hey, I need these because I'm not going back for a week. It really varies. But I think sometimes for me, I feel like it's easier to hand out the products when I have more of them, because there's like not that fear of I got to go back to the store and get it delivered again, because I'm a consistent user. I take one every day, like pretty much like medicine. It'd be no longer as precious when you have enough, like when you feel the sense of abundance. It's easier, right? It's easier to disperse them out. Yeah, because you have so many more.
Yeah, one of the things that at the very beginning when we first started working with cannabis retailers, and I was taking a look at things like grocery analysis and impact of grocery performance on cannabis, because the purchasing frequency cadence seems to be quite similar in a lot of instances. They used to do things with detergent where they would get customers to, buy twice as many as they usually would, which would create a blip in revenue, but actually push them out of the store for a longer period because there wasn't anything that was going to change. Like you're not handing out detergent. And so that's something to think about when building promotions. There's always unintended consequences to if you're changing the customer behavior in some way. What might be the impact? For your example, I would agree with you. I think that pre-rolled edibles would just become a situation where you become like looser with giving them away. You're just like, yes, one for all. But would that show up the same way, for example, with concentrate products, because those are more difficult to share? And so did you actually just push and pull around demand? And that's also why 420 is so complicated.
So how then do companies who are sitting down with you trying to understand the data and then make informed decisions that benefit their business but don't really hurt them, right? Like you're kind of inflate the way you described it to me, and stop me if I'm wrong. It's like you're inflating your numbers in the short term, but in the medium term, it might kick out like the next time I come back in.
Yeah, it is a part of the analysis needs to be not just like what revenue you generated, but there would also be like profit dollars generated, 2 different measurements, top line and profit dollars. But also what's the long-term impact of that? And so days between purchase. An edible consumer, for example, usually doesn't purchase on the same frequency or cadence of a flower consumer. Flower consumers purchase with less days between visits and edibles are longer. And so those are just things that it's not perfect. And there are, patterns. Could those behaviors all be adjusted? Probably. Could assortments be influencing those behaviors? Absolutely. Do marketing also? So when we look at the data, it's like, what are the things that might have influenced the purchasing behavior? And then what are the things that could influence the purchasing behavior in the future? And what is our definition of measuring success? Because we could measure, like, if we drop 20% off this weekend, it will create a massive lift in sales. But will it also create a drop off the weekend after? Maybe. Don't know for sure. But 420 looks like that this year is big inflated revenue numbers on the Friday and the Saturday and a drop off the week immediately after. And that has a tendency to kind of happen for the last 3 years in a row. So what does that really look like? And understanding just like where and how to look at that data and what measurements you're putting into place to define what success looks like is a big part of it.
So sophisticated operators are going to kind of look at everything and they're going to be like, okay, right now I'm either revenue focused, right? Where it means that they can put certain deals in place to increase revenue, or they could be, hey, margin focused, where they put certain deals in that push products that they get larger margins on. But there's always kind of this give or take. And so realistically, when you guys sit down with retailers, you kind of have to ask them, hey, are you trying to drive more sales in this product category? If so, these are kind of the playbook. Is that how those conversations typically go?
Yeah. And like, what's the intention of the promotion? Are we trying to bring in new customers? Are we servicing our pre-existing customers? Are we trying to get our customer to purchase something that they don't typically purchase? All would also influence it. So what we've been doing in the background is basically trying to build a data set that analyzes and understands the impact of promotions. And so on a cross analysis of saying the very best promotions will increase velocity and create limited margin erosion. And the worst promotions will create no velocity improvement and create massive margin erosion. Then where do promotions and efforts fall on this quadrant? And things that work for pre-rolls might not work for concentrates, and things that work for concentrates might not work for ounces, and things that work for ounces might not work for a pre-roll pack. And so measuring and understanding what is the intention, what are we trying to achieve, and what are our ultimate goals? Do these promotions feed up into it? Influences what the cadence of the promotion might be, what the frequency to which it shows up, and how we market it to different customers.
And elaborating on that, I would assume first-time customers who are ready to take that jump in might need a little more to be coerced to come in for that first time, maybe a little more nervous. And those customers might be even more valuable because if they've never spent any money before, they might get hooked on a new price category where their lifetime value might just continue to grow because they might find something, hey, like this really helps me. Instead of purchasing my 6-pack every week, I'm going to purchase a pre-roll.
Acquiring customers is definitely the most expensive when it comes to marketing in terms of if we were to measure it against bringing a customer back in. There are really important triggers within a customer's life cycle. And we define life cycle right now as 1 year because longer than 1 year is hodgepodge. Like there's just so much that has happened in that year's time, new stores opening, more customers coming into market, prices changing that could really influence that. So how do we get a customer from 1 to 3 visits? How do we get a customer from 3 to 5 visits? How do we get a customer from 5 to 8 visits? The average customer is making 8 visits in a year, average, not the best, but the average. And then what does like 8+ visit customers look like? And basically the 8+ customers are generating a significant portion of revenue. And the other customers that are in that path of 1 to 8 are all opportunity. And how do we motivate their behavior and keep them and make sure that they're happy and our teams enjoy working with them as well are all a big part of really dialing in and saying, yes, we've paid a lot to get the customer into the store. It could be sunk marketing costs, or it could be things like discounts at the POS. Now, what do we do to keep them?
Another variable, and I think we were discussing this before we started recording, is that turns out cannabis is fragmented in the United States, right? And so you see this in like mature markets, right? Like Colorado, there was huge push, states around it started legalizing, all of a sudden sales goes down and everyone's like, oh my goodness, what's going on? So like, how do these other factors influence the evaluation of these customers? Is there like some sort of way to look at that?
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the things maybe is that's the most common talked about topic within the industry is that our historical data is a mess. If we're coming from traditional retail will like not look at something without 7 years worth of data to like make a decision on. They're like, yes, we have a trend. And they're just like going in and pulling COVID right out of the data set and saying, that's not good data. We'll use the stuff around it. And when we get into cannabis, like that isn't in maybe legacy industry, that's possible, but that isn't so possible in rec environments for the most part, and most med environments also. And so it becomes an opportunity to say, what can we really see in this data? And to your point earlier, it's like we have a lot of information about our customers because we do things like ID scans. We can see where they're coming from, and understanding if you're seeing a decrease in a market, for example, is it coming from the frequency and the amount that the customers are spending, or is it coming from the number of customers that are contributing to that revenue? And it's a combination. You have price compression and you have market demand getting pulled into a different market, a neighboring market, and both of those things compound onto each other. So if we were to normalize and look at the number of units being sold, what does that look like? And that gets even more complex because Michigan sells on average like more than 2 units per transaction. Whereas in New Jersey, Illinois, it's very difficult to get past 2 units per transaction.
It must be even more difficult because like those are bad signals, right? Like what you're talking about now are as things have gotten bad, and you've recognized that. There's not like an alert that goes off saying, hey, Krista, we've got a problem. We need to make a solution now. So is there tools, or I wouldn't say alerts, that people can implement in order to, let's say, let them know that it's trending in the wrong direction before it comes to a point where one of those bigger customers that come every 8+ times a year, 3 of those guys decided they're going to go somewhere else? Is there any way to build in some sort of alerts to yourself so you're aware of what's going on?
Yeah, one of the first things is to not take a look at the business from a month-to-month perspective. And this is like a hot take one, but I hate months as a measurement of timeline because they're not created equally. Like, there are not the same number of Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays in every month. There are not the same number of days in every month. If we look at 2024 year to date, every month so far has a different number of dates and how those dates fell. And then we look at May, and May's got a lot of Fridays and has a holiday. And now everybody will be excited because the results in May are so great. So getting out of looking at it from a month-to-month perspective and creating equal analysis of time. Weeks are wonderful. To just take a look and say, like, are we trending in the right direction? And comparing your month trend also to the seasonal trend. So we see that sales increase May, June, July, August, September, and then kind of like drop off a little bit. Like, do you see the same type of behavior? That's the first thing. The second thing would be to understand who is contributing to the revenue and are there big shifts or changes. So if you segment out your customer base to be able to say, okay, these customers contribute X amount to our overall revenue, you can get more poignant to say, shoot, we have a problem with like this customer base. We've lost them. What do we need to do to potentially recapture them? And then you can dig into that and say, what do all of these customers have in common? Maybe like if you made an assortment change and maybe you stopped carrying a brand and then you're seeing something like a drop off, is it those customers that were historically purchasing? Have they made a repurchase? So you won't know anything unless you segment it. And the data has to be relevant to itself, meaning getting into like week over week analysis as opposed to month over month is much better.
And just to elaborate even farther, is like there's some data segments where you're looking at it from a defensive metric standpoint, understanding how to protect your core business. And then there's the offensive metrics, trying to acquire more customers and upsell your current customers, right? You should look at it in 2 different ways.
Yes. Yeah. Like if you're looking at a loss in the business, it's how, or like something that's impacting the business, how easy is it for you to spot is the first thing. And then what are the things that you are putting into place to be able to protect it from the future? So you're going to have customer churn. Is our cost of customer acquisition outpacing customer churn, basically?
Features versus benefits.
Okay. Yeah.
Are they the same? Are they different? Does the industry use it incorrectly?
Okay, did you read one of our blogs? No. It's so funny. Features and benefits are like crossed over in cannabis. They're just thrown at bud tenders, at teams, at inventory buyers as the same thing, but they're actually very different things. So features are the technical aspects of a product, and benefits are the outcomes that the customer gets from the features. And so if you were to, say, for example, go to a store and want to buy whitening toothpaste, the technical things that make it whitening toothpaste are going to be the features, and then the benefits are going to be the outcome that you get by having those technical parts within the product. And so with bud tenders, if you can coach them to work with customers to always do 2 features and a benefit. So here are 2 technical aspects about the product and the outcome that you get from those technical aspects. And it rounds out the product education and application so that customers can digest the information.
Where does price fit in? Is that a feature or a benefit?
Price is not a feature or a benefit. Thank you for reading our blog. Yeah, no, price is the value that a customer is assigning to a product. And the complicated thing about price is that 2 customers at any point are willing to pay different prices for the same product depending on what their perception of value is. There are going to be trends and, things that customers have in common when trying to assign value, but price is not a feature or a benefit. We should not be selling off of price.
But that is a common tactic used by majority.
Well, it's the easiest thing when you don't know how to talk about a product. Like for example, you would never sell me this pen. I'm holding up a pen. You would never buy price because you have no idea what the price is. You would start to talk about the features and the benefits of the price of it. The pen is not going to change the value of this pen to you. A price is like a cop-out feature, basically, and it doesn't add a lot of value to the customer segmentation. So if we connect product value just to numbers, then it's really easy to lose sight of what the other benefits are of the products and makes it really difficult to sell more expensive products in the long run.
But cannabis is already so hard.
Cannabis is so hard.
Why can't I just take the easy way out and just lower the price?
I mean, go for it. You'll see a velocity increase, definitely. There is, positive impacts that can come from lower prices. This is the hard thing, is that I can't just sit here and say higher prices. Everybody sell higher prices. In a beautiful world, yes, we would sell everything more expensive. But understanding what the customer's definition of value is to price is, I think, the area where we need to spend more time, as opposed to just laying out features, and trying to get bud tenders to remember them.
Do you think education can help with that? Or do you think education is like a lost soul from a marketing standpoint?
Okay, education is like a black hole. What does that even mean?
Sativa, indica, CBG, CBN, CBC,
this makes you
terpenes.
Happy, this makes you sleepy.
Yeah, you're just basically we're just throwing out information. I think that
information overload.
Exactly. The thing that I see teams most struggle with when I'm standing on a sales floor is how to apply the information. We have a group of bud tenders in this industry who are incredibly well educated or are self-motivated to understand features of the product. How they communicate the benefits is where things go awry. And so I'm biased, but I really believe that spending more time on basically sales-based training or communication. Sales is kind of like an icky word for a lot of teams, but it's actually communication strategies on how to share information with the customer is the area where we probably have the best room for improvement. And so I would quantify education as being communication-based education as opposed to only features and benefit education.
Does that responsibility fall on the brands or the dispensary?
I think it's everybody. I think a brand having a way to which they want to share communication, and then also having retailers be and working with their teams to be confident in how to create interactions. You don't gain confidence in how to communicate with somebody until you have practice. And I've seen a lot of instances where there's maybe scripts built, and scripts are great, but the moment that the customer goes off script, then this person's standing there being like, oh God, what do we do now? And that's not that helpful. And so they have to understand how to guide the conversation with the customer, and also how to be responsive to the customer and the feedback that's in front of them. And so I would say that it is brands' responsibility to make sure that the features and benefits are clear. And it is retailers' responsibility to make sure that their teams are confident in how to communicate with customers. So it's a team effort.
Slightly switching gears, if you could put anything on a billboard, metaphorically speaking, to get a message to billions of people, it could be an image, a quote, a word, or something that inspired you. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
You are capable.
What question do you wish more people asked you?
What does beauty have in common with cannabis?
What does it?
I was just gonna ask.
Both of you are like,
Well, I thought about it. I was like, I don't know. Now I want to know.
This is why it's a question. Beauty is interesting because it is a very complicated product. All of those products have a lot of features and benefits, and how they interact with an individual is different from person to person. And you are selling an end vision, not necessarily like the thing. So that's why I say, for example, skincare or fragrances, like you're selling a concept. You're not selling something where it's like you walk away and then you have a tool like a phone. So I think that it's interesting from that application. I think there's also a lot to learn from product commercialization, seasonal strategies, core assortment efforts, all of the above. But that's one of my favorite avenues to explore.
Dream smoking session, 3 people dead or alive.
Oh, okay. My grandfather, because he passed away before I ever had a chance to smoke with him. I think he'd be very entertaining while smoking. This is also a theme, but probably someone executive level leadership from Sephora that I could just like sit and ask a lot of questions to. And my first boyfriend that ever got me to smoke weed and revisit that as a mix.
Love it.
Because he's the one who introduced me to weed in the beginning.
Prediction time. Krista, discounting and double discounting is a difficult, successful strategy for retail businesses. How do you see this evolving for customers to not be addicted to the idea?
So you can combat discounting with newness and freshness. And the newness and freshness that a customer needs and a newness and freshness that you perceive in the business are two different things. So instead of things like blanket discounts, you could see more specific discounts. So instead of like 20% off flour on Thursdays, we're going to get into more like maybe either brand or SKU specific discounts. We're already seeing that trend, as well as making sure that they are like communicated, have an opportunity to really breathe success and then basically change and offer something new. So from our analysis in the data, there's like some really positive opportunities if you reduce the number of discounts, but offer newness in terms of what the promotions are more frequently. That doesn't mean like every single day, but that means that we're not running the same format all the time.
Kellen.
I'm glad we had this conversation. I would have had no answer earlier to that question. But I have a good answer now. My answer is I think that retailers need to determine what product category they're trying to increase revenue in, and then customize their discounts to increase revenue in that product category. So like if they're trying to increase concentrates, give discounts on concentrates, kind of similar to what Chris was saying in terms of being more targeted and not full blanket, but just a little different flavor. What do you think, Brian? Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think is the category that presents as the biggest opportunity? You said concentrates. Is that the thought process?
Honestly, I think flour is probably the biggest opportunity. A, it makes up for most sales, right? Like 50% of most sales. B, I think it goes back to one of our topics that we were discussing earlier in terms of it's one of the products where if I have more flour, I'm way more willing to share it. Right. So I think that if you discount flour, you're not going to see kind of the negative side effects as much as with edibles or some of the other products that take longer to consume. Right. Edibles, I know we classified it as that same one, so it doesn't really make sense for that argument. But I do think that flour, like if you have more flour, you end up being less stingy with it. So discounting flour isn't going to increase the duration the consumer will come back is one thought process I would have associated with discounting that product category.
And now I'm like, well, what about subcategory? Because
in terms
flour,
of like quantity,
it could be like, is it quantity? Is it Is our
a
subcategory
brand.
strain? Is it brand? Yeah.
And that's where
Is
you
it
could
price
get,
point?
and that's where you could get more that's where it becomes more custom focused for each retailer, right? And that kind of gets into what you were saying in terms of the subcategories and being like, okay, we have too much of this brand, I'm going to discount this brand's eighths, right? So that's kind of where you were going, the more finite, granular discounts.
Yeah, and being intentional with what we're trying to achieve. Yeah, you're spot on.
Before you shared like I would go back less frequent, I would have understood that discounting would have been helpful to purchase more and then I would come back. But thinking about it more, there's been a delay since I've returned. So recognizing this, the businesses are hurting themselves like twofold, right? They're making less money. And then Brian's not coming back to the store instead of every 4 weeks, it's every 6.5 weeks. So they're doubling up. So understanding the newness, sure, that makes sense. But I think turnover inventory might be even better for them to understand, hey, like we've got limited supply, come get this if you want this. And then having better data understanding of how quickly to turn this over will then lead them to not have to price promote and crush down on their products. Like Kellen was saying, just to dump products left and right. Like we got to be a little tighter with our inventory management system, guys.
Well, okay, what if in your edible situation, the discount wasn't for the edible that you usually buy?
Then I would definitely buy it.
Was something totally different, but within your product category that feels familiar. So it could be the same brand, but it's a different flavor or it's a seasonal flavor. Then would you have purchased it in addition to what you would have regularly purchased?
It depends on the flavor of the week, but you know where I usually get bought, and this I'm a sucker for this, and I know I'm a sucker for this, is the upsell on the pre-roll. Like I've got myself a bunch of edibles, and they're like, "Hey, here's this pre-roll that just throw it in, every time."
Well, the accessibility of the price point, the ease of use, all of those things. It's such a convenient based product. Yeah.
What is the impact of like, okay, discounting, right? 20% off, whatever, right? But like, what about like spend $50, get a free pack of joints? Like, does that have that same kind of impact on the consumer returning?
It has a different type of impact on the consumer returning. And then the other thing that it's interesting is that you control the cost of that much more. So like, your COGS on the product that you're giving.
Right?
Should.
The COGS on the cost of the product that you're giving away. It enables you to control that differently than just like a discount, for example. And so where possible, I am a big fan of introducing more product incentives than necessarily just like discounts, especially discounts off of whole transactions. It's a scary place to be.
So I think main takeaways, data, very important, actionable data, extremely, extremely important. And then make sure to segment your understanding of it to make good informed decisions.
Data means nothing without context. So if you want to make it actionable, give it some context.
So for those listening who are their heads spinning and they're ready to dive deep into how to understand features, benefits, and price, where can they find you, Krista?
You can find our blog. No.
Tell them where they can find you.
I'm here on LinkedIn. The whole team at Vetrina is really leveraging LinkedIn to share accessible information and helpful tips and tricks along the way. So we're pretty active there, or on our website at vetrinagroup.com.
Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
This was great. Thanks, guys.